In this lesson, we'll introduce the revolutionary ideas of Charles Darwin and how he changed forever the way we look at the biological world. First, let's consider what needed to be explained in his time. So if you were a naturalist in the 1800s, you would have been faced with several puzzles about nature. For instance, when we look outside into the world, we see lots of different kinds of plants and animals. And we call them species. So a species would be a population of organisms, and the individuals can interbreed and they can make fertile offspring. But it raises the immediate question, where did they all come from? What explains the origin of species, and why is there such great diversity on the planet? In addition, when we look at individual members of a species, like this individual praying mantis, we see the appearance of design. We can see the appearance of design right here on the forelimbs. These spikes here help the mantis hold on to prey and keep it immobile while it eats. Well, we would say these are sort of parts with a purpose. They perform a function to help the mantis survive and then reproduce, and this trait gets passed on to offspring. Biologists call these kinds of traits adaptations, features of creatures that help the organism survive and reproduce, and they are heritable, so they can be passed on from parent to offspring. Well, where did adaptations come from? In addition, the fossil record indicates that many species have gone extinct. Why do species disappear from the planet? In addition, species can be classified. We'll call this the idea that species are groupish, or they have a groupishness. We can identify some species as being very similar to others and yet different from still others. So, for example, there are many different kinds of species of bear, right? So we can lump all the different bear species into a category. Well, why can they be lumped into a category? Why do they share so many similar characteristics? And this is true of many other kinds of animals too. They are very similar to some species and different from others. Why is that? Well, in the 1800s, one common set of answers to these questions, or solutions to these puzzles, can be found in the thinking of William Paley. He was a Christian thinker, and his ideas capture many of the prevailing ideas at the time. So he's going to introduce what we'll call the design argument. He's going to make the case that living organisms, all the species we see in nature, were intelligently designed. And the argument goes like this. If we were to sort of walk down a path and stumble upon a watch like this, we would not think that that watch had always been laying on the path, because after all, it has parts with purposes, and we would naturally conclude that an object like this that has parts with purposes was designed and created by some intelligent designer. A human being made this watch. But if parts with purpose require an intelligent mind to make them, what about the mantis here? It has parts with purposes as well. Not only its spikes, but it's got eyes and brains and reproductive organs, and these are all parts with purposes. So for Paley, if the watch, because it has parts with purposes, must have had an intelligent designer, well then so too the praying mantis that has parts with purposes must have had an intelligent designer, and that intelligent designer was God. Now, Paley's views can be captured in a diagram like this. So here we'll consider three species: giraffes, chimps, and humans. From Paley's point of view, all of these species were created by God at some point in the past. They were separately created in a separate act of creation, and we will call that the special creation hypothesis. Now, how would that work? Well, the idea is that God, before making giraffes, God sort of had the idea or the plan or the design for giraffes. And we can think of this blueprint or the design plan as the essence of giraffe. Now, an essence captures those features or properties that make the creature the kind of creature it is. So the essence of giraffe would include its long neck, because giraffes have that long neck, and that's a distinguishing characteristic of giraffes. So the idea is God would think up the design, had the essence of giraffe in mind, and then God makes the first giraffes. Well, not only did God make the giraffes, but God equipped them with all of their adaptations so they could survive in their environment, right? That's the work of an intelligent designer. In addition, giraffes have the capacity for reproduction. So when giraffes reproduce, they make other giraffes. So the giraffes today can trace their ancestry back to the mind of God. All of the ancestors of today's giraffes were always giraffes, never anything different. And the same is true of chimpanzees and humans. So notice then the lines of ancestry never converge, they're parallel. At no point in time did humans ever have a non-human ancestor. At no point in time did giraffes ever have a non-giraffe ancestor. So this diagram then captures this common idea in the 1800s that God is responsible for the origin of species and equipping them with adaptations. And species did not change over time. The essence, by definition, is something that doesn't change, and if species had an essence, they could not have changed over time. Now, Darwin is going to make a radical departure from this Christian view of the natural world. In his 1859 book on the origin of species by means of natural selection, he's going to make one long argument against the special creation hypothesis, so against Paley's view. Here are a few of his main ideas, and we'll get to others in later lessons. That species did not have an essence, rather they changed in a process called evolution. Any two species on Earth had a common ancestor at some time in the past. In addition, species number multiplied over time, from a single or a few original species to the millions that we see today. And the dominant metaphor, then, for the history of life is a branching tree. We can call it the tree of life. And so if you take a look at this tree here, it has lots of tips on the branches, but if we trace those tips back down the branches, as though we're going back in time, those tips will all converge at some point. So any two branches will have a point of convergence, and Darwin would understand that point of convergence as the common ancestor species of those two currently existing species. So any two species on this tree would have then a common ancestor at some point in the past. In fact, all of the species currently existing could trace their common ancestry back to the first living things. So from Darwin's point of view, species evolved over time, species changed, and the number of species increased as the evolutionary process unfolded over time. Here we see a diagram from one of his journals, one of the first times he captures this idea of common ancestors splitting into multiple species. And here's one of the few diagrams in his famous book, again showing common ancestors diverging into multiple species over time. So if we were to now capture Darwin's view of our three species, the giraffe, the chimp, and the human here, it would look significantly different. So for Darwin, the lines of ancestry converge, which indicates that species had common ancestors in the past. For example, chimps and humans had a common ancestor. This species existed at some point in the past. It was one species. It's no longer around, so it's extinct. But some members of that species went on to change into today's chimps, and other members of that species went on to change into today's humans. But it's important to note that this common ancestor was not a chimp, and it wasn't a human, but no doubt it was some ape-like species. So Darwin's going to have to reject the idea of an essence. Species did not have an essence. Rather, they were changing over time. Of course, the great challenge for Darwin was to figure out how species were changing, and we'll get to that a little later. Notice then that there are significant differences between Paley and Darwin's worldview. So let's consider lines of ancestry parallel for Paley, all the way back to the mind of God, converging for Darwin. And here we see again that any two species would have a common ancestor. So for chimps and humans, the common ancestor would simply just be more recent than for humans and giraffes. Humans and giraffes would have a common ancestor, but it would be more distant in time, farther back in time. So chimpanzees and giraffes also have that same common ancestor down here. In addition, a difference has to do with the essence, the idea of an essence. Paley argues that the blueprint or design plan for each species, the essence of each species, was that thought in God's mind, and that's what makes giraffes different from chimps and humans. They have different design plans. For Darwin, species do not have an essence. They are changeable over time. And importantly, for Paley, the origin of species and the origin of adaptations can trace its source back to an intelligent mind. So remember, from Paley's point of view, species have parts with purposes, and the only explanation for that, from his point of view, is there must have been an intelligent mind designing those parts to have those purposes. For Darwin, there's a notable absence of an intelligent mind in the diagram. Now, that didn't mean that Darwin was an atheist, but he just did not believe that the best explanation for the natural world rested with this intelligent designer. He argued that this is a natural process of species change. So this natural process that he's going to call natural selection is a non-intelligent process. Right, so yes, it is true that species are different and they are equipped with adaptations, but for Darwin, that doesn't mean that they were designed by an intelligent designer. He will argue a natural process can produce features of creatures that serve purposes, the parts with purposes. But that natural process is a non-intelligent process. Now, I briefly wanted to introduce some of Darwin's evidence that species changed, and he writes about this in his book. We'll just go over four pieces of evidence, or four categories of evidence here very briefly. Exhibit A we'll call is the fossil record. Now, the fossil record wasn't that good in Darwin's time, but today it's much better. But the basic principle was in play that if, for example, very old rocks have fossils of fish and no other vertebrates, yet slightly younger rocks have fish and amphibians, no other vertebrates, and then younger rocks have fish, amphibian, and reptile, and so on. The fossil record then was capturing a process of change. So at one point there were only fish. Those were the only vertebrates living on Earth at some distant point in time. And then there were fish and amphibians. So clearly some new kinds of creatures came into existence. So the fossil record would be Exhibit A for Darwin. It seems to be capturing a process of species change. New organisms are coming into existence, and as we saw with extinction, some species are disappearing. The fossil record captures that. Exhibit B, a clever piece of evidence, he documented on his journeys around the world on the HMS Beagle. And he was very careful to note the distribution of species in the places that he visited. And so, in a sense, he's going to make the case that the locations of species provides a clue to the origin of species. So, for example, he's going to compare the species on oceanic islands off the coast of South America and off the coast of Africa. They had very similar climates, but very different species. However, there was an interesting pattern. The species on these islands were most similar to the nearest mainland. And Darwin's going to argue that that fact, that pattern of observations that he found all over the world, these kinds of pieces of information supported the idea that species could change. In addition, Exhibit C we'll call comparative anatomy. He's going to compare the physical structure of different species and find evidence for common ancestry. And indeed, even just the groupishness of species. So while originally we said this was something that needed to be explained, Darwin's going to have an explanation for why species are similar, very similar to some and less similar to others. And then again, it will involve this idea of common ancestry. So the reason why these two cats are more similar than the wolf is because the cats had a more recent common ancestor than either of them did with the wolf. So Darwin gathered together many different kinds of evidence, from fossil record to the distribution of species to comparative anatomy, just the groupishness of species, and in addition he looked at embryology, how embryos develop. And so he's got a wide variety of different kinds of evidence, and he lays this out in his book, The Evidence for Species Change. And then he goes on to propose in this book the mechanism of that species change. And that idea was called natural selection, and we'll take a look at that in another lesson.